We have a lot of material to cover today, so I'll just get cracking, and I'll stop from time to time to answer any questions. Today we're going to be discussing two of my favorite poets. One is Charles Baudelaire, the French romantic who kickstarted modernism and definitely symbolism. And the second is a later symbolist, Clark Ashton Smith from Auburn, California. Two very different poets who lived very different lives, but had a similar vision, partly because Clark Ashton Smith was inspired by Charles Baudelaire. But let's be serious, who wasn't inspired by Charles Baudelaire one way or another? And I'm going to start with a quote that will set the theme of this lecture. It's from Clark Ashton Smith's prose poem, The Skeleton and the Corpse, or The Corpse and the Skeleton. It's from his Dark Dandelion collection, or better said, from the Penguin Classics Dark Dandelion collection. And it goes like this. Time is a cheating merchant. He has given me this modicum of mold in exchange for noble corposity. Death, you will find, is a dull business, and without profit, despite the number of traffickers. Very interesting prose poem. I recommend it, like I will recommend all of the works that I will touch upon in this lecture. So the title of the lecture is The Beauty of Decay. And, how can decay be beautiful? That's something that Charles Baudelaire was the first to answer. Charles Baudelaire, who's known for his only volume of poetry that he published in his lifetime, Les Fleurs du Mal, was the first to create beauty out of things that are not traditionally beautiful. And even the French title for the flowers of evil, Les Fleurs du Mal, is very telling, because mal doesn't necessarily mean only evil. A better translation would be bad or ungood. Romanian translates it very well by rău, and rău as opposed to evil. It can mean pettiness, it can mean unpleasant things, is the opposition of good. Evil, when you think about it, is something, we see it as a force, whereas Baudelaire sees it as a category of existence. And what it's interesting about Baudelaire is that for him, evil, or better said, bad, exists in a tension, in a sense, between the beautiful, the ideal, and then we have the unpleasantness of everyday life. And this unpleasantness, this boredom, for Baudelaire at its most extreme, takes the category of spleen. And spleen is basically the opposition of ideal. And in that opposition, in that tension, arises Baudelairean poetry. And because this is a reading, as I said, this is a lecture in the sense that we're going to be reading together, I'm going to read one of Baudelaire's most famous poems. The French title is Un Charron, which would be translated as a carrion, but it has also been translated as a corpse. The subject of this poem is simple. The lyrical eye, the poet, one day when he and his paramour are walking on a summer day, they see a corpse in a ditch. And Baudelaire goes on to describe it. enough from me. Let's hear from the poet himself. Better said, from Nathan Brown's rendition of Baudelaire. So, recall the object we saw, my soul, that fine summer morning so soft, at the bend of the path, a carrion fowl on a bed bestrewn with stones. Legs in the air, like a woman aroused, streaming and oozing poisons, exposing with cynical nonchalance its belly full of fumes. The sun shone upon that putrefaction, as if to roast it to perfection, and restore to Dame Nature a hundredfold all she combined in that confection. And the sky regarded the superb carcass like a flowering broom. The stench was so strong that upon the grass you thought that you would soon. The flies buzzed above its putrid paunch, wherefrom withdrew black battalions of maggots flowing like a thick liquid along those living rags. All this was descending, rising like a wave, or sitting in glittering flecks, as if the corpse swelled with a rippling breath, live as it multiplied itself. And this world issued a strange music, like running water and like wind, or grain that the winnower with movement rhythmic stirs and shakes into his bin. These forms faded and were no more than a dream, a sketch slow to come upon the forgotten canvas, with which the artist completes by memory alone. Behind the rocks, a restless bitch was watching us with an evil eye, spying the moment to pick from the bones the morsel she had missed. And yet you will come to be kin to this filth, to this horrible infection, star of my eyes, son of my nature, you my angel and my passion. Yes, such you will be, O queen of the graces, after the last rites, when you go below grass and unctuous flowers to molder among the bones. Then, O my beauty, say to the vermin who will devour you with kisses, that I save the form and the essence divine of my lovers decomposed. For those who've joined later, this was a Carrion by Charles Baudelaire, Nathan Brown's translation. And in this poem, we have all of Baudelaire contained. First, I was talking about spleen and ideal, and the spleen for Baudelaire is a heaviness of existence, is ennui, alienation to the extreme. Baudelaire was born in 1821 and lived until 1863, if my memory serves it correctly. He was living in a changing Paris, in a Paris that was modernizing at a rapid pace, when the old proletarian neighborhoods were demolished for white boulevards, and France was, who had become a colonial power by that point, was basically at its peak of its civilization. And when civilization are at their peak, what comes? Decadence, decay. And that's the thing with spleen and ideal. Inside the spleen, the experience of spleen, we see the ideal. We see what could have been, that elation, that elevation. And ideal, the experience of the ideal, which for Baudelaire happens momentarily. It's moments when time ceases to exist. That makes spleen all the more burdensome once we experience again. And we shall revert back to Baudelaire poetry a bit later. But for now, let's talk about Clark Ashton Smith, who lived between 1893 and 1961 in Auburn, California. And he had a very different life from Baudelaire's. Baudelaire was born into a rich family. His father died quite young. His father was he was a civil servant, but he was also inclined to the arts. He never produced anything that I know of, but clearly his son inherited his talents, his graces. And his mother, Baudelaire's mother, to whom Baudelaire was attached, very attached until the end of his life, married pretty soon after his father's passing. And his stepfather was a retired general for most of Baudelaire's life. And he wanted young Charles Baudelaire, who was intellectually gifted. And he was one of those very gifted students, but also lazy. So he was basically the kind of student that wouldn't bother coming to class, would be absent-minded, and then would get A's when the exams came. He wanted Baudelaire to be either a lawyer or, in any case, something respectable, but Baudelaire wanted to be a poet. And he squandered his inheritance from his biological father that he received when he reached maturity, which I think in France at the time was around 18. And I think in less than 10 years, he was already deep in debt, and a state for which he was in for most of his life, for all of his life. After that point, he had very intense romance with Jeanne Duval, who was a demi-monde. She was a woman of mixed ancestry. I forgot exactly from what colony one of her parents hailed, but she was known for being an actress. But, you know, there are obviously accounts of her engaging in sex work or, you know, having what we might call today sugar daddies. And the thing with demi-mondes in French, in the French culture of that time, they were basically the cool ladies, the ladies you would want to come to a party, but you wouldn't want to be known to have invited her. They lived in a liminal state, and Baudelaire has many poems dedicated to her. And Baudelaire, he was definitely a heavy drinker, probably addicted to opium. In any case, he died of a cerebral attack in his early 40s, after he struggled with failing health from at least his mid-30s onwards. Clark Ashton Smith, his American apprentice, his American scion, was born in, I think, what we would call today a middle-class family. He was born on a farm. His parents were already pretty old when they had him, and for most of his life, he had to work to sustain them. And he lived until 1961, if my memory serves me right. But he had a troubled career because he had to work. He had to work. And what's more tragic is that he showed a lot of promise from an early age. I think he was in his 20s when The Star Treader and other poems was released. And he was already hailed as poetical genius. But the problem with Clark Ashton Smith was that he employed a lot of fixed form poetry that relied on meter and rhymes when modernism was starting to be entrenched, and his poetry was seen as a bit outdated. He also was a very shy young man, despite being very gifted. He also had health issues, probably pneumonia, but we don't really have a lot of accounts that state exactly what his health issues were. But but what we do know is that he never completed his formal education. Still, I think he spoke somewhere, or he knew how to read somewhere close to 5 languages. He translated Baudelaire. I couldn't find any of Clark Ashton Smith's translation also online of Baudelaire. I would have read from those, but that's what S.T. Joshi, renowned Lovecraft and weird fiction scholar, states that in his introduction to the volume from which I will be reading today, The Last Oblivion. It's a collection of poems from Clark Ashton Smith's entire oeuvre. Highly recommend it. It's a very good introduction to Clark Ashton Smith's poetry. And what's very interesting about Clark Ashton Smith was that he created a mythos, the Zootic mythos, which was basically one of the works that established the dying earth genre, popularized later by Jack Vance in his novel titled The Dying Earth, and more recently and more importantly by Gene Wolfe in Book of the New Sun. Now I'm going to take a bit of a break and check some questions and try to answer them to the best of my ability. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for noticing. Josh and Igor actually chose this setting because it would fit the idea of a lecture. I even wore a blazer because a few of you have told me that I give professor vibes, literature professor vibes, and I sought to lean into it. Oh yeah, and I know that in America, lawyers have their bookshelves. In Romania, in the law firm that I worked for, we didn't have a lot of bookshelves. It was all very corporate. Everything was done on computers with databases. Lawyers now use a lot of databases. It's not as romantic as the picture. Also, most of the things here are literature. Okay, and I'm mostly out of the camera. Thanks for pointing that out, Aurelian. Okay, so we're talking about the dying earth and of Zotic, and basically Zotic, I think, captures the idea of the spleen and the ideal, that tension better, because the dying earth for Clark Ashton Smith and for later writers as well is a world in which the sun is almost burned out, continents have changed, the world has reverted to a state of barbarism almost. All of the technology is absent, magic has resurged, and we are again dealing with a world of wonder, with a world of excess, because in Clark Ashton Smith, the stories are about decaying civilizations that are still glorious in a sense. Beauty is there. People are living decadent lives. There are emperors who are tired of having too many concubines and doing too many drugs, and it's an amazing world. It's also very sad. It's a very evil world. It's a world where evil has triumphed. And one thing that's very important in Clark Ashton Smith Smith's zootic and also his poetry is necromancy. And for Clark Ashton Smith, necromancy is the attempt to capture, to hold on to something that has passed, but it comes back twisted. It comes back a mockery of what it was once. It's basically like the carrion in Baudelaire. It's a combination of Baudelaire's carrion, which describes the process of decay, but also alludes to how Baudelaire captures his lover's races, the impression that his lover bestows upon him in a poem. So it's basically necromancy is a sort of poetry, and poetry is a form of necromancy for Clark Ashton Smith. And now I'll read from Clark Ashton Smith's Necromancy. My heart is made a necromancer's glass, where homeless forms and exile phantoms steam, where faces of forgotten sorrows gleam, and dead despairs archaic peer and pass, grey longings of some weary heart that was possess me, and the multiple supreme, unwildered hope and star-emblazoned dream of questing armies, ancient queen and lass, risen vampire-like from out the wormy mould. Deep in the magic mirror of my heart, behold their perish beauty and depart, and now from black aphelions far and cold, swimming in deathly light on charnel skies, the enormous ghosts of bygone worlds arise. So yeah, that was Clark Ashton Smith. And that's what you will get in Clark Ashton Smith's zootic stories. The zootic cycle for Clark Ashton Smith is how Clark Ashton Smith tried to peddle his work towards weird fiction magazines that were appropriate at the time. He wasn't interested in plot, he was more interested in form. I'm not going to revisit all of that. I have a YouTube video for anybody who's interested up on my channel. But what you should take from this is that Clark Ashton Smith, he was a poet that wrote poetry, wrote a kind of poetry that was not popular at the time, but he had an inclination for a sort of world building that was in high demand for a moment in the 30s. He was friends with Robert Howard, with H.P. Lovecraft. He even has a couple of poems dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft. They were more like pen pals. I don't think they ever met, or they didn't, maybe once or twice. But they deeply respected one another as writers. Pretty much what we do here on Substack. And he put all of his poetic genius in those stories, in that world. And these stories, you don't really read them for plot. The plots are very simple, sometimes a bit contrived, but the impression, the feeling that they leave you is so powerful because it's that combination of spleen and ideal that we get in Baudelaire. Oh, and Aurelian makes a very important point, like Venice. Yeah, Venice is a pretty dying earth kind of city if you think about it. It's going to be under the water. I don't think in our lifetimes. I don't know, maybe in my son's lifetime. But it's a sinking city. It's a city full of splendor, full of art. But it's also dying. It's also going to disappear. And still, I think that's why decay is beautiful, because decay is a process. We get to see it happening. It's also natural. You know, decay is something that inspired the Romantics when they were looking at moss-covered ruins, at falling, crumbling statues, ancient statues, like in Ozymandias. They knew they could see glimpses of a world past, and that gave them a sense of awe, but also a deep sadness of the transience of existence itself. And the opposite of decay is not, I won't say erasure, because there are a lot of erasure poets here, and that's a beautiful art form, but I'm going to say deletion, destruction, annihilation. And that's something artificial, that's something man-made, annihilation, complete destruction and replacement. And I see this in my city, in Bucharest. A lot of old buildings are getting torn down and replaced by modern, ugly, corporate office buildings. And I don't get to experience decay. Like yesterday, I took my son out for a walk through my old neighborhood, and I wanted to show him, places of my childhood, but I realized, most of them were gone and replaced. They weren't crumbling. I think the only thing that was close to a ruin was this old sign for a market. Here in communist countries, we have, with communist built neighborhoods, they had like a central little market with grocers and farmers coming. And we basically built pharmacies and betting parlors and pawn shops, and they were gone. But we still have that old Piazza Pajre market, rusty, few letters missing, and probably one of these days is going to be taken down and to be like it never was. We don't have ruins in Bucharest, and that's something very sad for me. That's very sad, because decay is a beautiful process. We look at something that was there, but it will be no more. And it's also something, like we see that nature perseveres. Nature takes back, as Baudelaire put it, what was once her. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to do this little lecture today. And I'm going to read now a prose poem that deals exactly with the beauty of decay, a prose poem written by Ashton Smith, and it's called The Image of Bronze and the Image of Iron. And it goes like this. In the temple of the city of Morm, which lies between the desert and the sea, are two images of the god Ammonon, a bronze image facing an iron image, across the fires and blood stains of the altar stone. When the gory sunset of the day of sacrifice is over, and the wreathing fires of the sacrifice are dead, and the moon smiles with a cold and marble smile on the blackened altar, then Ammonon speaks to Ammonon with a voice of iron and the voice of bronze. Thus, and not otherwise, the image of iron speaks to the image of bronze. Brother, when the censers, which are wroth of single sapphires and rubies, had returned the air to a blue mist of perfume, and the red serpents of the fire were fed on the heart of the sacrifice, I dreamed a strange dream. Methought in some far day, a day as yet unprophesied of the stars, the temple and the city of Morm, the people thereof, and we, the images of its God, were one with the sand of the desert and the sand of the sea. Stone was fallen from stone, atom parted from atom, in the corruption of rain and wind and sun. Lichens and the desert grass had eaten the temple to its plinth, and the cold, slow fire of rust and verdigris, crawling from mouth to nostrils, from knees to throat, had left us twain a little pile of red and green dust. The roots of a cactus clove the altar stone, and the shadow of the cactus, like the uncouth finger of some fantastic dial, crawled thereon through days of blue fire and nights of sultry, sulphurous moonlight. Blown through the lonely marketplace, the wind of the desert offered the dust of kings to the wind of the sea. And that's exactly what I mean when I say the beauty of decay. Nature takes back what was hers. The temple, the glorious temple of Amnon, is made more splendid in a sense by the desert, by the cactus, and all the sapphires, all the rubies have faded. And it's, we can read this little prose poem as a memento mori, but I think that considering that Clark Ashton Smith was a Baudelairean, he alludes to something more. He alludes to that feeling of awe that romantics such as us, you can always be romantic. You don't have to be to have been born during the romantic age to be a romantic. Experience. We see how little, how insignificant we are, but then again, from that little point, we get to experience how great and awful, awe-inspiring the cosmos is. And now I'm going to read and answer some questions. Okay, so Aurelian points out something very interesting. He says that the Substack comparison is matching, except for one thing. The conversation was always offline and direct. Yes, it was. It was offline and direct, the conversation, but they also had correspondences. They had letters, and from those letters, we get to glimpse into their minds in what they thought about their art. And I think in one of Clark Ashton Smith's lecture, he describes and answers some of his critics. He doesn't answer those critics directly. He just speaks to Lovecraft. And a lot of Clark Ashton Smith's critics, they said that, he's too focused on fantasy, too focused on things of the imagination. He's not focused on the social realities. And back then in 20th century modernism, there was this current of art that dealt with social realities, especially in the rising Soviet bloc in Marxist realism, and also in America and the UK. But Clark Ashton Smith, he says, I'm not interested in reality. I'm interested in what I can produce with my imagination, and that's very interesting. But great point, Aurelian. Oh, and Luciana says something very beautiful. Decay will feed the bloom. Yes, that's exactly what's beautiful about decay. It's how it feeds the bloom. Okay. And Igor Vorona says something very beautiful. There was a ruined school on the path I took to my grandma's old house. It had cool vibes, and I might have visited in primary school when it was normal. Now it's been restored, but lost the charm. Exactly what I'm talking about. And I get that. I actually inherited a house up in Moldova, in Bukovina. And it's a early 20th century merchant's house. And the problem we are facing now is how to preserve its beauty, because the house is falling apart, but also restore it. And That's the problem. As you take, you know, those glass window panes and you put those plastic ones, those PVC white ones, and yeah, it's ruined. It's ruined. And one of my friends, Bogdan Stoichescu, he's also here on Substack. He said something very funny. He lived for most of his life in the UK. He only visited Romania during holidays. He said, you know, I love Romania. It's a very beautiful country, but what I really hate is those PVC windows that you always, you know, like you pass through the middle of the town and you see PVC windows, you know, stores with PVC window fronts. Horrible, horrible. Yeah. Okay, so Aurelian says, I remember reading this 25 years ago, but today it touched me more. Dust of Kings. Beautiful. Okay, and Maya says that she doesn't have a question. She's really enjoying this. Thank you, Maya. And she says that she remembers a comment I left on one of her posts. My memory does not serve me. Now it's the middle of the night here, past the middle of the night. And now I would like to read one more poem from Clark Ashton Smith, and it's called The Last Night. And this actually describes the Zotik, the dying earth, and it's very beautiful. And he says, I dreamed a dream. I stood upon a height, a mountain's utmost eminence of snow, beholding ashen plains outflung below to a far sea horizon, dim and white. Beneath the spectral sun expiring light, the world lay shrouded in a deathly glow. Its last fear-laden voice a wind came low. The distant sea lay hushed as with affright. I watched until the pale and flickering sun, in agony and fierce despair, flamed high, and shadows slain went upon the gloom. Then night, that war of gulf-born titans won, impended for a breath on wings of doom, and through the air fell like a falling sky. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful image. And I really like how Clark Ashton Smith takes it all back to the classics with what's the word? The war of gulf-born titans won. That's how he describes the night. With reverting back to the titans, the entities, the gods that were before the ancient gods of Greece, that the Greek god Zeus and Hades and Poseidon overthrew, and who at one time they almost tried to take Olympus back again from the gods. And the titans were tonic forces. They were forces of nature. They weren't civilizing forces like Zeus, Athena, and they weren't forces of order. They were forces of power. And here, power in the form of night, the vengeful and unbeatable force of time's passing triumphs finally. And Gene Wolfe in Book of the New Sun has a very beautiful passage, a very sad passage of the protagonist, Severian torture. He glimpses in the far future, and he sees the world, which, mind you, was in a dying state. The sun was slowly dying out, but there were still a few thousand or maybe even 100,000 years left uh, until it completely expired. But he sees even further in the future, and he sees the snow that has covered even the tallest mountain peaks. Because in that during that part of the book, Severian is in a house that cheats the laws of time, and from its windows he can see in the far future, and that house is on a very tall mountain, and from that vista he sees in the future, and he sees that everything, all the valleys are filled with snow. And this poem took me back. And I'm gonna close with another poem by Clark Ashton Smith. But now, after seeing if any of you have some more questions, I'm gonna read a longer prose poem by Charles Baudelaire, but I'll take some pauses to comment upon it. Okay, no more questions. And I'm gonna read from The Double Chamber, which is the basic summary, the distillation of Baudelaire's spleen and ideal in a description of a surreal bedchamber. And it's from his Little Poems in Prose collection that was published after his earthly passing. And very beautiful work. It's also free to read on Project Gutenberg, and that's the translation that I'm reading from. And it goes like this. A chamber that is like a reverie, a chamber truly spiritual, where the stagnant atmosphere is lightly touched with rose and blue. And this year we have symbolist synesthesia. The atmosphere is lightly touched with rose and blue. And he says that a chamber that is like a reverie. So we're already put in a place that it's not really, it's a locus, a space, but it's not a physical space, it's a spiritual space. And he says, there the soul bathes itself in indolence, made odorous with regret and desire. There is some sense of the twilight, of things tinged with blue and rose, a dream of delight during an eclipse. The shape of the furniture is elongated and low, languishing. One would think it endowed with the somnambulistic vitality of plants and minerals. The tapestries speak an inarticulate language like the flowers, the skies, the dropping suns. There are no artistic abominations upon the walls. Compared with the pure dream, with an impression unanalyzed, definite art, positive art is a blasphemy. Here, all has the sufficing lucidity and the delicious obscurity of music. And I'm going to stop here because if my reading does it any justice, you can already feel musicality. We have rose and blue appearing, giving rhythm, and Baudelaire actually borrows the prose poem, prose poem which was coming into its own with a book whose author I cannot remember his name right now, but he was also a musician, that French author, and he published a single book of prose poems, and in that he interplays music and fiction and literature, and that's what makes, in my opinion, a prose poem. A prose poem is that focus on musicality, on rhythm, and we have here, and Baudelaire says something very interesting: the delicious obscurity of music. And I am reminded here of Schopenhauer. I'm not exactly sure how deeply acquainted was Baudelaire with Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer was a huge influence on all romantics that came after him. And he was also a romantic himself. He was a reader of Giacomo Leopardi, the first true romantic, an Italian poet. who lived a very short and sickly life. And Giacomo Leopardi is one of the first exponents of modern pessimism. And in Giacomo's Leopardi's work, we also have decadence, decay, and he actually has a comment in his Zibaldone, his personal commonplace book that was published, I think, for the first time in the 20th century, long after he passed. And in that, he has a passage that stuck with me, and he says that we are now, and he was speaking, mind you, of early 19th century Italian. He was saying we're living now in the old age of mankind. You know, we don't have the purity of the ancients of ancient Greece. We experience our world unraveling. And yeah, it was a time of great change. And Schopenhauer was a great fan of Leopardi. He was and Leopardi influenced a lot of Schopenhauer's worldview, which was deeply pessimistic. But also in Schopenhauer, we have the ideal, or what he calls will and representation. And basically, Schopenhauer argues that the whole world is a representation. We don't experience the world as is, we experience a representation of it. That's a rough summary, probably. I'm saying a lot of things wrong, but we'll use for now. And Schopenhauer has this idea that music is the supreme art form because it's the most abstract. It's the one that gets us closer to the will, which is this abstract force that guides the whole universe. And we're all, in a sense, generations of the will to live. And he says music, because it's the most abstract, it's the most pure. And Baudelaire here alludes, and there's definitely a resonance when he says the deletions of obscurity on music, because we can't really describe why music moves us. You know, like we hear something and we are taken back to, or our mood changes faster than when we look at visual art or we read something. Sometimes, you know, like, you know, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm in a very good mood, I can't really read something that's deeply, you know, sad or gloomy or depressing, because it's a huge disconnect. But that's just my experience. And okay, and Aurelian says very strong connection between words and sounds. And yeah, Aurelian is the one to know that. He's a musician and a poet. So he probably knows a lot more about this than me. And back to Baudelaire. An infinitesimal odor of the most exquisite choice, mingled with a floating humidity, swims in this atmosphere where the drowsing spirit is lulled by the sensation one feels in a hothouse. The abundant muslin flows before the windows and the couch, and spreads out in snowy cascades. Upon the couch lies the idol, ruler of my dreams. But why is she here? Who has brought her? What magical power has installed her upon the throne of delight and reverie? What matter she is here, and I recognize her. These indeed are the eyes whose flame pierce the twilight, the subtle and terrible mirrors that I recognize by their horrifying malice. They attract, they dominate, they devour the sight of whomsoever is imprudent enough to look at them, and I have often studied them, these black stars that compel curiosity and admiration. To what benevolent demon, then, do I owe being thus surrounded with mystery, with silence, with peace and sweet odors? Oh, beatitude, the thing we name life, even in its most fortunate amplitude, has nothing in common with the supreme life in which I am now acquainted, which I taste minute by minute, second by second. Not so. Minutes are no more, seconds are no more. Time has vanished, and eternity reigns, an eternity of delight. And that's Baudelairean ideal here. Time disappears and eternity reigns. And it's spurred by the presence of this idol, this feminine idol, who, you know, uh, she, she can be in this case many things. Baudelaire's paramour, Jean Duval, in one reading, beauty itself incarnate, but one thing is certain, everything vanished. And we don't even know if she's the one, if the idol is the one that creates this whole atmosphere, or this whole atmosphere summons the idol. But one thing is sure, the poet here experiences the ideal, and time disappears. But this eternity of delight is cut all too short by what follows. A heavy and terrible knocking reverberates upon the door, and, as in a hellish dream, it seems to me as though I had received a blow from a mattock. Okay, and mattock, which is a word that I had to Google, is an agricultural tool used to digging ditches for, holes in which to throw grains, in which to where you will sow. And we have all this beautiful, transcendent experience cut short by the blow of a mattock, which for Baudelaire would have been a very uncouth tool. I'm not even sure how many mattocks Baudelaire would have seen in his life. He was a city boy from Paris. And yeah, horrible experience. Then a specter enters. It is an usher who comes to torture me in the name of the law. An infamous concubine who comes to cry misery and to add the trivialities of her life to the sorrow of mine. Or it may be the errand boy of an editor who comes to implore the remainder of a manuscript. The chamber of paradise, the idol, the ruler of my dreams, the sylphide, as the great René said, all this magic has vanished at the brutal knocking of the spectre. Horror, I remember, yes, this kennel, this habitation of eternal weariness is indeed my own. There is my senseless furniture, dusty and tattered, the dirty fireplace, without a flame or an ember, the sad windows, where the raindrops have traced runels in the dust, the manuscripts, erased or unfinished, the almanac with the sinister days marked off with a pencil. And this here is the shift into spleen, into boredom, into ennui, in which dreary days go senseless, and we are reminded by the misery, by our commitments, by the things that we procrastinate upon. We have the image of the errand boy of an editor that comes to ask for Baudelaire's, for the poet's unfinished manuscript. Horrible experience. To remember you have a deadline, or that you missed the deadline when you were in eternity a moment ago. And that's one of the things that is a huge distinction between, and an important one, between spleen and ideal. We have time as eternity in the case of the ideal, and the heaviness of minutes, of seconds, days and days passing by, which is the spleen, the boredom. And here, for the last stretch, we have, and this perfume of another world, whereof I intoxicated myself with a so perfective sensitiveness, alas, its place is taken by an odor of stale tobacco smoke, mingled with what I know not what nauseating mustiness. Now one breathes here the rankness of desolation. In this narrow world, narrow and yet full of disgust, a single familiar object smiles at me. The phial of laudanum, old and terrible love, like all loves, alas, fruitful in caresses and treacheries. Yes, time has reappeared. time reigns a monarch now, and with the hideous ancient has returned all this demoniacal following of memories, regrets, tremors, fears, dolors, nightmares, and twittering nerves. So yeah, laudanum, opium. That's basically, one way we can read the poem is this poem is, by saying, like Baudelaire was probably riding an opium high one moment, and then, he comes down and reality sets itself back, and his focus is now upon the vial, which he describes beautiful as terrible, like all old loves. And there's also a very interesting biographical note to be made, is that Jeanne Duval, although she was Baudelaire's lover, she was not, exactly loyal. And still, he was a very sensitive man. After all, he is one of the greatest poets to have ever lived. And he he describes, like terrible, like all ancient loves. And that's the thing with all loves, with all loves that last after many years. Boredom, spleen sets in. We get tired of what was once, like our paramour, our ideal, and we focus on the little habits, the vial of opium, or like the stale tobacco, the cigarette, like the little habits that makes the passing of the days less dreary. And let me finish this poem before I go back to any of your questions. I assure you that the seconds are strongly and solemnly accentuated now, and each, as it drips from the pendulum, says, I am life, intolerable, implacable life. There is not a second in mortal life whose mission it is to bear good news, the good news that brings the inexplicable tear to the eye. Yes, time reigns, time has regained his brutal mastery, and he goads me as though I were a steer with his double goad. Woe, thou fool, sweet then, thou slave, sweat then, thou slave, live on, thou damned. And that's the thing, time, the is something horrible if you think about it. After all, why do we measure time? Because we have to be somewhere on time. We have to, get to our jobs, get to our go to bed on time, so that we have energy, so that we can be productive little drones for the machine. And that's the sad state of eternity, of something transcendent. We go outside of time, and we go back into time, and reality hits us like a mattock. And that's why I think Decay is beautiful, because we look, at a rotting corpse, at a falling ruin, and we say, why do I struggle? Why do I struggle when nature is so beautiful and it doesn't need me? Nature, the great dame, she doesn't need us. She's beautiful without us. We are lucky to experience it. And Decay is that. We realize our own mortality, and then we get to see it, to see the world bloom anew, as Luciana put it. And Luciana observes Schopenhauer takes on Neoplatonist themes. And yes, there's obviously some connections to be made there. And Aurelian observes poetry went into philosophy like philosophy went into psychology. And yeah, that's an interesting point. Giovanni Papini early 20th century modernist writer, Italian. He has a book. It's called Gog. Yeah, the title is Gog, and I think the protagonist, this Gog fella, who um, he interacts with a lot of strange characters, which are representative of different movements from the fin de siècle, the late 19th century, early 20th century ideas and movements. At some point, he meets Freud, and Freud there says that he wanted to be a poet, but his family was too poor for him to afford being one, and he had to go into medicine. And he goes into this the Freud, Papini's Freud goes into this whole discussion of how his psychoanalytical school is basically him trying to implement ideas from the symbolist and the romantics movement in psychology. Very interesting book. I've read it a long time ago, so I might be misremembering, but go check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Okay, and Aurelian says, Hawking teaches that there was a time without time, when all was one. I enjoy the truth in this poem and the lies in it. Yeah, Aurelian doing poetry here in the chat. And Akira says, Baudelaire writes with a fervor that reminds him of Rimbaud. I think, I'm not sure if he's referring to Baudelaire or to Freud here, but the French symbolists are basically Baudelaire's epigones. They were all trying to be Baudelaire. Verlaine, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, they were all inspired by Baudelaire. And Baudelaire has a lot of the things that were salient of the symbolism movement. He has synesthesia, the mixing of the senses, seeing colors, tasting sounds. He was also the first flaneur, the first street stroller, to translate it roughly. He liked to walk through Paris and through the good parts and the bad parts, and that's what inspired him. His poetry was, in a sense, the first citadine poetry, the first urban poetry, the first poetry that sang the beauty and ugliness, because let's admit, cities are ugly, but finding beauty in ugliness, that's, the duty of a poet. Okay, and Luciana says something very interesting. She answers Aurel and she says, they have shared belief that music is not merely an aesthetic pleasure, but a direct metaphysical bridge to the ultimate nature of reality. And yeah, that's something that we have even going as far back as Pythagoras, if I'm not mistaken. Pythagoras was also a musician, and there was this idea. Basically, in music, we have mathematics deeply connected to art. You can't make music without referencing mathematics in a sense. Even if you disregard it, you have to actively disregard it. It's an active act to disregard numbers in music. You have to acknowledge them at least. And okay, Luciana makes another very interesting point. Both Schopenhauer and the Neoplatonists viewed the structure of musical composition as a direct map of the universe. Neoplatonists had the music of the spheres. Schopenhauer sounds like the kind of guy who'd be into that. He was probably into that. He was a very well-read guy. Also, Schopenhauer was a fan of Lord Byron's, but they had a falling out when they went after the Save Woman, and after that he never forgave Lord Byron. Okay, very interesting discussion. And now, the double chamber, I can't speak of the double chamber without recommending you this book, Arebu, Against the Grain or Against Nature, by Huysmans, J.K. Huysmans. And this is a decadent novel. It's also interesting fact, it's the novel that inspired, in a sense, Dorian Gray, the picture of Dorian Gray. And Dorian Gray, the character. Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's novel, he goes mad, in a sense, after reading a book that had yellow covers, and it's most likely Arabo, which was a very scandalous book. It's a novel without a plot. It describes this aristocrat, the last son of an of a French aristocratic family, des Etienne, and he decides to live a life of pure pleasure. He retreats into his house and he constructs a lot of interesting constructions, and he even changes his schedule in a way to maximize pleasure, to maximize aesthetic experience. And that's the whole novel. It's pretty short, and as you can see, and there's also a very beautiful reading on LibriVox, and you can also find it on YouTube. The reader there does a great job. I love listening to that book, and that's basically, when I read this poem, when I was selecting the readings for today, I I read the double chamber, and I said, okay, so that's probably where Response got the idea for the Zentian. That's basically the plot, or the driving goal of the protagonist of the Zentian in his man's book is to experience the ideal inside the world of spleen. A very, very interesting book, and very Baudelairean. Oh, and Luciana has something very interesting. So Luciana did a very beautiful essay on Tudor Arghezi, which is a Romanian modernist poet, amazing poet, but like with all great poets, like you probably will have to learn Romanian to experience him fully. And she asks if there's a connection between Tudor Arghezi's Flor de Mucegai, which means the flowers of mold, and Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, the flowers of evil. And from my teacher, God rest him, from my literature teacher in high school, Mr. Victor Lishman, of blessed memory, he taught us that Tudor Arghezi was in active conversation with Baudelaire, and he decided to go for the flowers of mold, as trying to bring down the Baudelairean poetics to something more concrete, more earthly. Because, evil, if you go and ask the average bloke on the street, or the average gal on the street, the average person, and obviously this is a construction, there are no average people, but let's imagine an average person, somebody who doesn't really read that much or at all, and you ask him what do they think about evil, they will not really have an opinion about evil, like they won't have something discussion, but everybody experienced how nasty mold is. Like we all like fight mold. Like we'll have that. We always had, like always rented an apartment that had moldy, or we knew somebody that struggled with mold. Like mold is a reality, it's a concrete reality. And Tudor Arghezi, as far as I was taught, was heavily influenced by Baudelaire, and there was an active conversation. But that's at least what I remember from my teacher. It was, pretty great, but I haven't really thought about Tudor Argesi, but go read Luciana's essay on Tudor Argesi. Really interesting. I've read it on my email. And Aurelian says, learn Romanian, you are asking for a lot. Well, maybe not learn to speak it, but, to read it. If like the thing is about what's beautiful about Romanian is if you know French, even a little bit, you won't have that hard of a, it won't be that hard for you. But yeah, I know, I'm asking for a lot. But luckily you have Luciana's translations. It's something we should all be grateful for. Yes, and Luciana says, so again the decay theme. Yes, there is that decay theme. Even mold. And the Flowers of Mold by Tudor Argesi was inspired by his time in prison. And the last poem of the night, the second last poem, I actually have a surprise for you. So the second last poem of the night, it's by Clark Ashton Smith, and it's called The Last Oblivion, title of this volume. And here we have a beautiful cosmic interplay of spleen and ideal. And it goes like this. Not while the woods are redolent with spring, or scentless immortalless of autumn blow, shall I evade you loveliness or no, surcease of love and love's remembering. But happy wandering worlds and cycles hence, through unforeseen fantastic avatars, I shall forget you in the future stars, and take of time an alien recompense. Till in some strange and later planet, wroth from molten shards and meteor dust of this, my hand shall pluck an unsuspected bloom that lifts again the scarlet of your kiss, and I shall muse and loiter, knowing not the love that perished like a lost perfume. And here we have what separates Clark Ashton Smith from Baudelaire. Clark Ashton Smith was very cosmically minded. He was oriented, and here he describes his love very beautifully as something that, despite all the transience of existence and all this ever-changing of becoming, there will be that little bit after, countless rebirths through countless worlds, will pick unsuspected his avatar from the future, who will not even be human, will pick an unsuspected bloom and smell and feel that love, that amor, I can't think of a better word, that he has for his paramour in a bloom. And here we have synesthesia, like that smell that takes you back. And this, I think, is what, Clark Ashton Smith does to Baudelaire. He goes and takes Baudelaire, who was citadin, who was, in a sense, a man of his time. And Baudelaire was a man who lived inside modernity. He was at the forefront of modernity, whereas Clark Ashton Smith was, in a sense, reactionary, but still he's oriented towards the ideal, to the cosmic ideal. And here we have in The Last Oblivion, he will forget everything and all that he ever was and all the worlds, but still that love will live a bit on, because that's the thing with love. It's for Baudelaire and for Clark Ashton Smith, it's a glimpse of the ideal. It's a way to touch the ideal. And Baudelaire, he says so in a letter that, you can experience the ideal through, aesthetic access, intense feelings, and even says intense virtue. Like with mystics, they experience the ideals, and in all of the mystic traditions, that have existed or that we have record of. There is this idea of experiencing timelessness, of experiencing the ideal, and that's what unites them, all poets and mystics. Okay, so Aurelian says, for the decay he might actually learn Romanian. Great, like that's there's one thing to learn Romanian for, is for the decay. Even our greatest novel is a decadent one, Rakes of the Old Court. And what's beautiful about Rakes of the Old Court is that it's also a glimpse of decay, because it was written in a language that was old at the time when it was written, and now I think it only survives because of that novel. A lot of people will learn those words. I learned a lot of those words from that novel. And Aurelian says, as a Norseman, he's grateful for Luciana's translation. And he says there's no French in him. And he says that he has people to teach him now. He might give a try. Yeah, there's plenty of good people here. Ash Pages, Igor Vorona, Luciana Morano, me to a certain extent. So my Romanian is only a bit better than my English. So I'm trying. And for now, to wrap this up nicely, and to allude to another future lecture, the future Candlelight Lecture that I might do, is on George Bakovia, who's also a 20th century symbolist. Luciana, again, has some great translations by him. And he has this poem that circles back to time as a cheating merchant, the quote that we read in the beginning from Clark Ashton Smith, The Corpse and the Skeleton. And the poem would be translated as Days Flow. The days flow toward the cemetery, sad one by one, and unraveling the thread of life, they go forever on. And there, slowly, in a quiet hush, they gather into sighs with a longing for tomorrow, their sister with a longing for me. And that's Bakovia, was also a musician. He played the piano, and his poems have this musicality that marks all the symbolism and the science, the epigones of Baudelaire. Because Clark Ashton Smith was not necessarily a symbolist. And all great poets, that's the thing. They go beyond their movements. And I have to recommend you this poem by Clark Ashton Smith. It's called The Hashish Eater, or The Apocalypse of Evil. That's a beautiful, epic encapsulation of cosmic decay. And I'm going to read it on a special occasion, maybe when I reach 1,000 subs, who knows. It's very long and very tiresome, but it's a beautiful poem that I highly recommend to you. Oh, and Luciana says she also has translations by Bakovia's wife. Yeah, she was also a great poet. And without Agata Georgescu Bakovia, I hope I got her maiden name right. She actually helped Bakovia's poetry reach a wider audience, because he struggled with depression for most of his life, and she was his champion and best friend, and a great poet in her own right. Really amazing. Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Aurelian, for sharing your thoughts, and thank you, and Luciana especially, and everybody here, but Luciana and Aurelian, I felt that they've co-hosted this live, and hopefully in the future, next time when I'm going to be doing teams like this, one of them or both of them will join me on the live. Thank you all. Thanks, Andy, for the compliments. It's 1 o'clock here, and I'll see you next time. Much love, Fanny.